There is a place on this earth where time seems to have stopped, where the ocean whispers secrets to rusted steel, and the wind moves through hollow corridors like a ghost searching for something it lost long ago. If you were to stumble upon it, and very few people ever have, you might think you were dreaming. A massive ocean liner, alone and silent, rocking gently in the swells as seabirds nest in her smokestacks and the sea slowly reclaims what men once built with such extraordinary pride. She is enormous. She is broken. And she is, against all reason, breathtakingly beautiful. This is not a story about decay. This is a story about resurrection. Stay with us until the very end, because what this ship became will genuinely stop you in your tracks. She was born in the early 1920s, in an era when the ocean liner was not merely a mode of transportation, it was a declaration of civilization itself. The world had just survived the catastrophic bloodletting of the First World War, and humanity, battered and grieving, was hungry for elegance again. Shipyards across Europe and America roared back to life, belching fire and steel into grey skies, as nations raced to outdo one another on the high seas. To build the grandest ship was to announce your country's power, your industry's genius, your culture's refinement. And so they built her. She was laid down in a Scottish shipyard on the River Clyde in 1924, her keel stretching nearly 600 feet along the slipway. Thousands of rivets were driven by hand into her hull by men who would never once step aboard as passengers. Men who ate bread and dripping for lunch and carried their wages home in envelopes. They built her with their hands and their lungs and the years of their lives, and they gave her something that no modern factory can replicate. They gave her soul. She was launched in the spring of 1926, sliding into the Clyde amid roaring crowds and champagne showers, her hull painted in the deep black and cream of a proud shipping line whose name was synonymous with prestige. She was christened before thousands of onlookers, flags snapping in the coastal wind, a band playing on the quayside. She displaced nearly 20,000 tons and could carry over 800 passengers and 400 crew. She had 3 funnels, 2 of which were functional and 1 of which existed purely for the psychological comfort of passengers who associated more funnels with more power and more safety, an elegant lie, if there ever was one. Her interior was a monument to the Art Deco movement, that stunning marriage of modernism and opulence that defined the interwar years. The first-class dining room rose 2 decks high, panelled in satinwood and walnut, lit by chandeliers that threw warm gold light across white tablecloths and silver cutlery. The smoking lounge was upholstered in deep burgundy leather with inlaid marquetry panels depicting the ports of the world: Southampton, New York, Havana, Cape Town. There was a ballroom with a sprung maple floor, a library stocked with leather-bound volumes, a barber shop, a gymnasium, a swimming pool tiled in Moroccan blue and white. She was, in every sense, a floating city. A city designed to make the wealthy feel as though the Atlantic Ocean was merely an inconvenient stretch of water between one cocktail party and the next. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as we are, hit that subscribe button. Because we uncover stories like this one every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Her maiden voyage in the autumn of 1926 took her from Southampton to New York, a route she would come to know better than any captain who ever stood at her helm. She made the crossing in just under 7 days, and every one of those days was an event. Mornings began with deck promenades, passengers wrapping themselves in rugs provided by white-gloved stewards who delivered bouillon and biscuits with the solemnity of priests. Afternoons dissolved into card games, lectures, shuffleboard, and the particular luxury of having absolutely nothing required of you. Evenings erupted into music and dancing and the clink of crystal and the particular laughter of people who have, at least temporarily, left the problems of the world behind on a distant shore. Her passenger lists during the late 1920s read like a roll call of the century's most extraordinary figures. Film stars traveled in her first-class staterooms, their names whispered by second-class passengers who strained for a glimpse in the corridors. Industrialists and diplomats, novelists and musicians. A Maharaja once occupied her largest suite for an entire Atlantic crossing, bringing 17 pieces of luggage and a personal valet. She was a stage, and the ocean was her theatre. The Great Depression hit her hard. It hit every ship hard. When financial catastrophe swept across the globe in 1929 and deepened through the early 1930s, the leisured classes who had filled her first-class decks suddenly found themselves with considerably less leisure and considerably less class. Bookings fell. The shipping line slashed fares and rebranded her second class as tourist class, democratizing the experience in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. She carried emigrants from Europe to the Americas, families with everything they owned packed into trunks, seeking a future that the old world could no longer offer them. She became something different then, something arguably more important. Not a luxury, but a lifeline. When the Second World War came, she was stripped of her finery almost overnight. The chandeliers came down. The walnut paneling was covered over. The swimming pool was drained and used as a storage hold. She was repainted in naval grey from waterline to funnel tip and pressed into service as a troopship, carrying thousands of soldiers across waters she had once crossed carrying socialites. She made runs across the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. She survived a torpedo attack in 1943 that left a 30-foot gash in her starboard hull and killed 11 men in the engine room below. She was patched up in Gibraltar and sent back to sea within 6 weeks. The men who had built her on the Clyde had built her to last, and she proved them right in the worst way imaginable. After the war, there was a brief and genuinely lovely renaissance. She was refitted, not to her former deco glory, but to something clean and new and hopeful, in the spirit of the post-war years when the world was desperate to believe that beauty was still possible. She resumed her Southampton to New York service, and for a decade she thrived again. But history was already preparing the blow that would end her. The jet age arrived without warning and changed everything. In 1958, commercial jet aircraft began crossing the Atlantic in 7 hours. 7 hours. What she did in 7 days. Within 5 years, transatlantic passenger numbers on ocean liners had collapsed by nearly 80%. The math was brutal and absolute. Why spend a week at sea when you could be there before lunch? The romance of the crossing meant nothing against that arithmetic. One by one, the great liners were retired, sold for scrap, or repurposed. Her owners held on longer than most, running cruises to the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, trying to reinvent the voyage as the destination itself. For a while it worked. But the costs of maintaining an aging ship, the boilers, the hull plating, the machinery that required constant hands, grew heavier every year. In 1979, she made her last commercial crossing. There was no ceremony, no crowd on the quayside. The shipping line had already announced her retirement, and the financial reality of even docking her at a permanent berth was proving untenable. She was moved to a sheltered anchorage off the coast of West Africa, a quiet bay where the water was warm and the winds were gentle, and there she was left. The plan, if there was ever a genuine plan, was to eventually sell her to a buyer who would convert her into a floating hotel. Negotiations went on for years. Nothing came of them. The money was never quite right, the vision never quite clear, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world forgot about her. And for those of you who've made it this far, thank you. This is exactly the kind of story that deserves to be told, and your support by liking this video means the world to us. Alone in that bay, she changed. Time and salt and heat and neglect worked on her the way they work on everything. Slowly, inexorably, and with a strange artistry. The paint blistered and peeled, revealing the steel beneath in great abstract swathes of rust, orange and brown and deep arterial red. Vines found their way through broken portholes and crept along her promenade decks. The ballroom floor, unprotected now from the tropical rains that found their way through corroded deck plates above, buckled and warped. The library's books dissolved into mulch. The grand staircase that had once felt the footfall of diplomats and dancers rotted at its base and tilted at a surreal angle, like something from a dream. The swimming pool filled with rainwater and became home to mosquitoes and then, improbably, to frogs. Nature reclaimed her with the quiet efficiency it brings to all abandoned human things. But she was still there. Still floating. Still, in her ruins, magnificent. In 2019, a team of marine architects and heritage conservationists heard about her through a contact in maritime insurance who had come across her during a survey of the anchorage. They flew out to see her on a chartered flight, took a small boat across the bay, and climbed aboard via a rope ladder dropped from her gangway door. What they found left them, by their own account, speechless. Not because of the decay, though that was profound, but because beneath the decay, the bones of her were extraordinary. Her hull was structurally sound in ways that defied all expectation. The steel the Clyde workers had riveted together nearly a century earlier had proven extraordinarily resistant to corrosion in the sheltered conditions of the bay. Her internal frame was largely intact. Her 3 funnels, green with oxidation, still stood. And her lines, the long, sweeping, confident lines of a ship built in an era that understood beauty as an engineering virtue, were still breathtaking. The lead architect on the team, a woman who had previously worked on the restoration of a 19th-century iron sailing ship in Bristol, stood on the listing bridge deck and looked out across the bay in the late afternoon light and said, later, that she knew in that moment exactly what this ship could become. The challenge was staggering. To transform a derelict ocean liner into a habitable luxury residence required solving problems that had no precedent, because no one had ever attempted quite this before. She would need to be refloated properly, her hull assessed and reinforced, her superstructure stabilized. Every system, electrical, plumbing, ventilation, structural, would need to be entirely rebuilt from scratch. The rot and rust would have to be removed with surgical precision, because the goal was not to erase the past but to honor it. The vision was explicit from the beginning. This would not be a ship pretending to be a house. It would be a house that remembered it was a ship. The project attracted a consortium of investors, several of whom were motivated less by the prospect of financial return and more by what one of them described as the moral urgency of not letting this thing disappear. Heritage funds contributed. A luxury residential developer came aboard with experience in converting historic buildings, a Victorian power station in London, a Florentine monastery, into high-end residences. A naval engineering firm from Rotterdam handled the hull work. And an interior design partnership from Copenhagen, known for their ability to make new things feel ancient and ancient things feel alive, took on the interiors. The restoration took 4 years. 4 years of cutting away the hopeless and preserving the irreplaceable. Workers in respirators and welding masks descended into her hull daily, reinforcing frames, replacing plating where necessary, but always, trying to save what could be saved. Original decorative ironwork was painstakingly stripped of paint and rust and restored to a finish that revealed, for the first time in decades, the extraordinary craftsmanship of its making. Art Deco details, moldings, fixtures, tile patterns, were catalogued photographically and then either restored in place or faithfully recreated where they had been too badly damaged to save. The grand staircase was rebuilt using timber from the same species of oak as the original, sourced from a sustainably managed Scottish forest. A quiet echo of the Clyde, brought back across the water. The ballroom floor was relaid in maple. The smoking lounge paneling, miraculously mostly intact beneath layers of paint and mold, was cleaned and restored and glowed once more with the warm grain of its original walnut. The chandeliers were gone beyond recovery, but new ones were commissioned from a glassblower in Venice who studied photographs of the originals and produced something so faithful that only an expert would know the difference. The swimming pool was perhaps the most dramatic achievement. Retiled in the original Moroccan blue and white, using tiles made by the same family-run manufacturer in Fez that had supplied the originals a century ago, it was reopened and filled with sea water circulated by a new filtration system hidden behind restored original paneling. To float in that pool, surrounded by tiles that had been dreamed up in the 1920s and now gleamed under LED lighting designed to mimic natural Atlantic daylight, was to occupy 2 moments in time simultaneously. The ship was repositioned from the West African Bay to a permanent mooring off the coast of a Portuguese island in the Atlantic, chosen for its calm waters, its extraordinary light, and its relative seclusion. She is anchored now in water so clear you can see her hull below the surface, the old steel clean and repainted, her waterline crisp against the blue. Above that waterline, she is transformed. Her promenade decks are planted with low Mediterranean herbs and flowering succulents in long planters that run the length of the ship, their roots anchored in specially designed lightweight growing medium. Her funnels, all 3 of them, the 2 real and the 1 beautiful lie, are painted in a deep muted green that references her rust-colored years in the bay, an acknowledgement that her abandonment is part of her story, not a chapter to be ashamed of. The main deck houses 8 residential suites and 4 common living areas, each one a distinct conversation between Art Deco heritage and contemporary Scandinavian restraint. The materials throughout are honest: stone, timber, aged brass, linen, leather. chosen to age gracefully alongside a structure that has already proven it knows how to endure. The bridge, fully restored and electrified, has been converted into an observatory and library, its original brass telegraphs and binnacle polished and standing in their original positions. Now decorative relics surrounded by deep armchairs and shelves of carefully curated books on maritime history, exploration, and the natural world. At night, the glass of the bridge windows reflects the stars above the Atlantic, and you can stand there and look out across the same water she crossed 100 times in her working life, and the silence is extraordinary. She accommodates 12 residents at a time, across her 8 suites, each named for one of the ports she once called at. The New York suite, the Havana suite, the Cape Town suite, each decorated with archival maps, photographic prints, and objects sourced from those cities that connect the room, quietly and specifically, to a particular moment in the ship's history. The staff numbers 22, including a historian in residence whose sole role is to know her story completely and share it with whoever wants to listen. She is, now, perhaps the most extraordinary private residence in the world. Not because of the quality of her fittings, though they are exceptional. Not because of her location, though it is stunning. But because of what she carries within her, the weight of a century of human experience, the accumulated stories of the thousands who sailed in her, worked in her, survived in her, danced in her ballroom and wept in her corridors and stood at her stern watching the old world disappear beneath the horizon. Transformation is rarely tidy. It is almost never fast. And it requires, above all, the willingness to look at something the world has discarded and see not what it is, but what it could become. The men who built her on the Clyde gave her a century of life they could never have imagined. The men and women who restored her have given her a second century. She floats now in that Portuguese light, patient and magnificent, the Atlantic moving beneath her as it always has, indifferent to human time, indifferent to human categories of old and new. She is neither. She is simply, stubbornly, beautifully, here. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing of all.